So a little bit about myself and Hannah. We are both certified partners of Anecdote International, and we have extensive experience in doing storytelling for leadership. And we work with companies around the world supporting a more impactful communication. And we love storytelling, but we also love today's topic, which is inclusion, because the fact that we speak about inclusion is also that we speak about exclusion or lack thereof, of inclusion. And I think we've all felt left out at some point in our lives. So that's why we love this topic. And together with me, I am an engineer and living in Germany and coming from Spain. So this is something that also can give a lot of opportunities for exclusion or feeling, in an engineering world where all of my colleagues are male and I'm the only woman. I've often been asked if I am the secretary. Just to say a little hint, and the rest I will leave to your imagination. So with me in the line, I say hello to my co-trainer, Hannah. Hello.
Hi, thank you very much, Maria. Yeah, so my name is Hannah. I go by she, her. I have blonde, short hair, and I'm wearing blue glasses and a red top. And just like Maria, I have the cultural contrast in the fact that I'm British, but currently living in south of France. But probably more closer to home for me in terms of inclusion is I'm also a late diagnosed neurodivergent. And so I know very well firsthand the difficulties of fitting into a neurotypical world. And, sometimes the misunderstanding of understanding what neurodivergence is can lead to some pretty interesting assumptions of what we make about people, some of which we're going to pick up on in this webinar.
And we are not alone. Together with us, we brought an arsenal of people working in this amazing subject. They're not here in person, but in spirit. And we are starting with a big one.
Absolutely, our favorite, Brené Brown and her measuring stick. And if you speak to most organizations, they will say that they're wanting a much more inclusive workplace. And many have, spent time and energy putting in some great policies with some really good intentions. But sometimes it just misses the mark of making that real cultural behavioral change. And in fact, when we decided to put the workshop together and the webinar together, Maria and I started messaging friends, colleagues, even messaging strangers on the internet, asking for success stories of where they've seen really good examples of change in terms of inclusion. And we were quite surprised that we got a lot of response, not all positive. Many said that there were change, but most of it was ineffective. Either it was not properly implemented or some of the policies were just being plainly ignored. The problem with inclusion is, unfortunately, it's not a nice, neat, tidy box ticking exercise. Obviously, yes, collecting data is incredibly important if we're wanting benchmarking and making way forward. But as the great Brené Brown says, stories are data with soul. So maybe if we just listen more, we could make that more of an effective way of collecting data to make a more inclusive place. Because the thing is, if we're not asking stories, how can we collect the data and really understand what's happening within our organizations? And another great expert on this aspect, talks about this aspect a lot, is a guy called John Amici.
Yeah. So Hannah, you're right. John Amici is here. You can see him. And the first thing you may notice is that he is really big. He's in fact big enough to become an NBA player. And that's what he did, actually. In fact, in February 2007, John Amici was the first former NBA player to publicly come out as gay. And once he retired from basketball, he focused on his purpose, which is organizational psychology. And in one interview, he's talking about the discoveries he had when he was researching about what companies did to help women's career development. And he says we started to see these programs for junior women to be more assertive and to speak up in meetings. And when these women would get to a more senior level, so suddenly they were going to a new program on how to be less assertive because their managers and their direct reports found it difficult to have to deal with this assertiveness coming from women. And what John says is, in other words, many of the solutions are designed to armor a minority rather than weaponize an environment. There's nothing wrong with women, how they behaved first and then second. It's not like they have, they're expected to have a different behavior. It's like the environment, it was what we need to look at, right? And it may have seemed logical at first to give these women training on assertiveness, but that's the thing. Sometimes we just jump to conclusions too fast. And here's another example of jumping to conclusions too fast. This is a story I heard from a friend of mine from the time she was living in Australia, like 10 years ago. My friend was friends with a man called Tom, and Tom is in a room, in a business meeting with Marianne, and they're talking about a project together, and all of a sudden Marianne notices that Tom is looking at her breasts. And well, she's very annoyed, but she doesn't say anything. She lets the meeting finish, and then afterwards she goes to the HR department and tells them what happened. So the HR responsible talks to Tom and goes through a one-on-one. And that's when Tom says that, he's autistic and he has a lot of trouble focusing on people's eyes. And that's why he of course, it wasn't his intention to look somewhere else. And it wasn't his intention to look at her breast or make her uncomfortable at all. But it was his way of just reacting to a difficult situation. So they put all of three in the room, HR and Marianne and Tom, and they finally found a solution for Tom. He could be looking at the forehead, he could be looking at the nose, or he would just talk about difficulties he was having. And for Marianne, or whatever other person that could have been in a similar situation, they could just pick up and say, well, this is what happened, and it's not okay for me. Another example of assumptions happens when we work in international teams. We know, just a fun factor, Hannah and I were collaborating a lot with Anecdote partners, and some of them are located in Australia because that's where the company is based. And it's very funny because we're sitting here very cold, putting more layers in and more layers. And, they're on t-shirt, it's a different day. They're in the morning, we're at night, and they're just jumping to the beach. It's very funny. But that is the fun part of working with international teams. There are some difficulties, however, also as well, right? So one example is we worked with an organization that has colleagues sitting in Europe and some colleagues sitting in India. And the Christmas holidays, they're not so long ago. They make a lot of sense here in Europe. Nobody works actually for 3 weeks, basically. But in India, they make not so much sense. Like they actually don't have, many of them don't celebrate Christmas, are not Christians. The problem was when they were asked or suggested or forced, whatever you want to say, to take vacation on that time. And of course, the employees complained because it wasn't okay from their point of view. But rather than seeing this as a negative thing, it's actually a great example of the power of stories, because they expose us to things we wouldn't think about. And it leads to a conversation and it leads to solution.
And here is another great example of where a simple conversation could have made a real difference. Again, we have two really well-intentioned Braille signs for elevators that ended up leading to quite expensive mistakes. So as you can see in the first picture, the Braille has been put on a bumpy surface. So, I'll leave it to your own imagination to work out why that didn't work. The other picture you can see is a beautiful, sleek design of Braille. So sleek, in fact, that the Braille is perfectly flat and again, therefore, completely unusable. So to make a difference, could it just simply be as simple as invite to and involve to include? But we're talking a lot about inclusion, but what is inclusion and why is it important? So quite often you'll see diversity and inclusion put together, and equally they're both important. However, we want to stress that the workshop that we're doing is really, really focusing in on just inclusion, because that's where we feel that stories can really help change a culture. And one of the best ways I've seen to understand the difference between what is diversity and what is inclusion is by a quote by Werner Meyers. And they say diversity is being invited to the party, whereas inclusion is being asked to dance. I think that's just such a beautiful, simple way of understanding the two. Another thing you may be hearing in the headlines is something called quiet quitting, which has become quite a topic of conversation. The act of self-exclusion because perhaps employees don't feel valued, seen, or supported. And this can be especially true for invisible diverse disabilities. Yet sometimes in order to make a difference, it doesn't always need massive policy changes. Sometimes simply giving someone a space to share what's going on for them can make a real difference. Mm-hmm. Last month, I was speaking with a friend called Marion, and she is an extremely bright, full of brilliant ideas with a very strong work ethic. And she also happens to be autistic. Now, people with autism in general tend to need much more time to process information and also can struggle with social situations. And she noticed that there was a huge difference during COVID when her company moved all over to Teams. Suddenly, every time she opened up her computer, her diary was full of meetings, but without any context whatsoever about what was the meeting for. There was no specifics. And so each time she turned up to the meeting and was really struggling to understand what was going on and what was expected. And yet she was still expected to contribute her brilliant ideas, but on the spot. And that for her just wasn't possible. And after several months of this, it really started to affect her performance and her confidence, and ultimately led her to sort of stepping back and disengaging with work. And it took a conversation with her boss to ask, what's going on? What do you think is happening? And she explained about the meeting. And once her boss understood this, she simply sent a memo across the whole of the department and made a change, said, if you're going to book a meeting, must add meeting notes. And that simple exchange of information and then that simple email of action changed everything. Marion stayed with the company and the company managed to retain her brilliance. So if diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, how will we know what dance to practice if we don't know the steps that are required?
Beautiful. Now I'm going to give you one of the things that are the foundations of our training. If you want to consider this training later on, is the different communication styles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run two parts of this TED Talk where the speaker chooses two different communication styles. And I want you to notice and see if there's a difference in the way it comes at you.
I've never known life without disability. Disability is where a physical or mental condition or impairment is combined with physical or social barriers that make it hard for a person to do certain things or interact with the world around them. Disability is very diverse, with a wide range of experiences that can affect a person's ability to see, move, hear, learn, communicate, or interact with others.
All right, so that's the first part. The second part, I have to tell, it's about when she talks about her sister. I'm gonna go directly here.
But it was made clear to me that the rest of the world didn't always share this value. Like, I'll never forget one time in middle school, my sister's aide had made a video of her learning how to communicate using speech and sign and thriving in an inclusive classroom where she was loved and accepted just for who she is. And I brought it to school wanting to share, to give my classmates the opportunity to learn more about autism, only to be told by my teacher that the faculty had decided against it to protect me from other students inevitably making fun of her.
So if you compare both parts, I want you to maybe write in the chat, share with us, how do you connect with each part? And how are they different from one another? So maybe I'll give you a couple of seconds. The second part connects more due to emotions. Okay, thank you, James. Yeah. The second part is a specific story that sparked the emotions. Yeah. Part one, called distance data. Part two, more animated, lively, and telling it. Yeah, very good. So yeah, this is an example of this concrete versus abstract. And while both communication styles are needed, we can work on the balance between both styles, right? And in order to become more impactful communicators. Thank you for your answers, for your contributions.
Brilliant. Okay. Also, during the workshop, we'll be exploring different story patterns, whether it's story triggering, story listening, but also stories for influencing change, especially behavioral change. You may have heard the phrase behavior breeds behavior, and that goes for whether the behavior is good or the behavior is bad. And behaviors within an organization will usually set the standard of what is acceptable. After the Me Too movement, it became quite clear that sexual harassment is a worldwide issue. And here in France, unfortunately, I have seen many of examples of how this is just normalized, especially in the quiet acceptance of it is what it is. But in 2017, the French-based company Energy wanted to attract more women into their very male-dominated environment. And they realized that in order to attract these young female engineers, they needed to make sure that they were providing good career opportunities as well as safe working conditions. A European conference at the same time was brought up, they brought up the discussion of sexual harassment in the workplace, and NG asked themselves, well, maybe, is this something that we need to address? But at this time, there were very few reports of sexual harassment. And so the company didn't feel it was much of a priority. But the question, why was there not many reports made? Maybe it wasn't a safe environment to make those reports. However, due to some French legal restraints made at the end of 2018, they decided to build a new initiative from scratch. This required asking HR and diversity volunteers to become references, and they started off with 70. These people were then retrained and educated in different areas. They also created an external hotline, so it was absolutely completely away from the company, but it was backed up with legal lawyers and psychologists as well. And as the communication grew about the scheme, this has now grown to more than 120 volunteers over Europe. And although obviously it's not going to be a problem that's solved overnight, the understanding and also the much more open discussions and the shared experience is certainly having an effect on changing the cultural behavior. So from a company finding nothing to now changing its attitudes to the narrative of it is what it is no longer acceptable, and that's can only be a good thing. So, and also another powerful use of stories is how we can make a small change to communication and make a worldwide movement. Collecting, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, collecting data is becoming more and more of an important factor for corporations. And as someone who collects data for a profession and former COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg certainly had a lot of data to confirm the lack of women in leadership. And she wanted to make a change and encourage much more women into the C-suite. In 2010, she was invited to a TEDx Women's Speak to talk there. However, the night before she was due to fly out for the talk, her 3-year-old was clinging onto her leg going, "Mummy, Mummy, please don't go," which some of us might have experience of. When she arrived at the TED talk, she was speaking with her friend Pat. Although she was not speaking about her non-personal, full of facts and figures talk, she was simply talking about how she was having a bad day and was recounting, last night I was leaving the house and my 3-year-old is pulling on my leg going, "Mummy, Mummy, please don't go." And Pat looked at her and said, "Well, you've got to share that. You've got to share that in your talk." And Sheryl looked at her very shocked and said, "Are you kidding? I'm not going to share that." And then Pat said, "But you have to. If you want to encourage more women into leadership, you have to share how hard it is." And so from that simple change of understanding how to change her talk, she completely rewrote all of her talk. And the talk included story after story after story, which seemed to speak much louder than the data that she had before, because this then went on to a best-selling book and then onto a worldwide movement called Lean In, which currently has around 35,000 Lean In circles in over 160 countries around the world. So interesting. I wonder how different this campaign could have been if her friend hadn't suggested to share her story.
Yeah, very different, I guess. It's the same that what happens with Brené Brown. She talks about her changing the last minute, going from this robotic and data thing to I'm going to tell my story and make breakthrough, right? So it's very interesting. All right. So if you want to know more about what awaits you in case you want to consider doing this story-powered inclusion public program that will take place in March, let me give you a hint of what is going on here, what we're preparing. Basically, this storytelling for leaders will be matching this inclusion topic, and it will give you a tool to help your organization. And this could be a test for to see if this is something that is good for your company. What we'll do, we are in the webinar today, so it's the left part. And then we will do 4 virtual sessions, 2-hour sessions, where we create the impact you want by understanding the power of stories. We'll do in the session 1, unite and align everyone towards a common goal by communicating decisions through stories. Is the second one. The third one is influencing people's perspective by dispelling preconceptions and painting a new vision of the future. And the fourth one is lead by example to create a workspace that uses storytelling to foster trust and respect. And in between, we'll make you work. You will give us videos and we'll coach one-on-one each of you to give you the experience that you can get better at your storytelling, and you will practice a lot, by the way. And because, habits don't change in just a couple of weeks, we've realized that, so Anecdote has realized that this first part is not enough. And what they've added for a couple of years now is these weekly nudges to give you, like for 24 weeks, give you a little bit of something to work on for a week, like 10 minutes to focus on one aspect of stories. So this will create the change that you will notice from the first minute, I guess, but in the end, in order to make it sustainable, you need a longer time working on it. It will be plenty of practice, demonstration, and a lot of repetitions and getting better. And we're working on that as well, Hannah, aren't we?
Indeed.
Yeah. yeah, so I think we are done with the material that we wanted to give you, and now we want to ask you if there's any questions that you want to discuss with us now. You can come up to us if you have any more questions. We also have collected some resources that you can take a look later on, and that have helped us a lot to prepare this. And before we go, we would like to give you a last task. And it's to, like Hannah was saying, inclusion is inviting people for dance. We want you to invite someone to dance with you, to have a conversation like the one I had with Danny, a DEI advocate in Ireland. Danny told me that he had been in an event in the Irish Center for Diversity, and in this event, there were different speakers, and they described themselves so that the visually impaired could picture them. And that's why we started saying, I am Maria, I go by she, her, and I have a yellow t-shirt. So maybe this is something that is not very natural or organic. I know it is not in my organization, but yeah, it was a great idea. And it was something that I wouldn't have heard if I wasn't looking for stories. We need to hear stories because stories change us. So thank you so much for being here with us. And yeah, goodbye.
Thank you.